I want to discuss a possible exam question in Christian thought. Faith is opposed to reason. It's a fairly general question, but really it applies to the section on knowledge of God. And it raises a number of issues that we need to unpack in our opening paragraph. First of all, what is faith? According to Dawkins, who obviously is attacking Christianity and the God delusion, he says faith is the great cop-out because of lack of evidence. According to another writer, Paul Donovan, faith is the intuitive awareness of God, and that's something we can link to Thomas Aquinas and his argument about synderesis, if you recall, in natural law theory. Look it up if that doesn't ring any bells. Faith, says H. Farmer, is the decisive commitment of the whole person to another. In other words, the emphasis here is on relationship. And I think most Christians would be closer to that third definition than to something to do with the intellect alone and with evidence alone, empirical evidence. Jesus himself said, "Those who receive me in a relationship and believe in my name, God gives power to become a child of God." John 1, chapter 1, verse 12. Receive, believe, become a child in relationship seems to be what the New Testament suggests is faith. What therefore is reason? Well, reason is not just, contrary to what the logical positivists such as A.J. Ayer argue, primarily about verification and empirical evidence, or a priori truth, such as we find in mathematics. Because reason has many dimensions and can include relationship and knowledge that comes from it, such as the statement, "I love you," that most people make at some point in their lives. Reason has this element of metaphysical belief and metaphysical ideas. It's about what we believe about the world and what we believe about concepts such as love, which are inherently non-empirical. It's hard to put an empirical test for them. Both Dawkins and Hume take a limited and restrictive view, we could say, of reason, which misplaces the debate. It places it from a general discussion of reason into a specific form of reason, or really two forms, the empirical and the a priori. And that, we could say, is a false move. It's a restrictive move. We could then go on to discuss natural theology. For Calvin, the natural world is like a mirror, and Paley argues that the world is like a beautifully designed watch. Hume famously criticizes this view of natural theology because, for example, there are plenty of ambiguities in the world, of tsunamis and viruses, and we don't, according to Hume, have enough universes to observe whether there is a regularity that suggests a designer God. So there are problems with the design argument which you can rehearse by going back to philosophy of religion. We can then go on to discuss whether reason and revelation are actually opposed, and I would argue they are definitely not opposed to each other. They tend to be set up like that. And there is some warrant in the Bible, because Proverbs chapter 3, for example, says, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart and do not lean on your own understanding." But I would argue from a philosophical viewpoint, it is impossible to read the Bible without some kind of reason in oneself being engaged. Calvin argues that reason is corrupted by the fall, and therefore is a very deficient way of accessing God. But there is a tension within Calvinism, because although he argues, I quote, that in this ruin of mankind no one experiences God either as Father or as the author of salvation, nonetheless Calvin argues for a sensus divinitatis, a general understanding of the divine, some sense of something existing beyond us, which Calvin argues is general to all human beings. However, back to the reason and revelation point, we all mediate the Bible through our own culture, Think, for example, of how a chapter such as Leviticus 18 has been interpreted over time. It has within it the greatest verse possibly in the Old Testament, love your neighbour as you love yourself, Leviticus 18:19. It also suggests in the same chapter we should stone people that practice gay sex and people, particularly women, who commit adultery. And that is not something that our reason in our generation accepts. Neither, incidentally, did Jesus. And therefore, what we're doing when we come to Scripture is we are applying interpretation, selection, and integration, those three things, of our own philosophical viewpoint with what we read in front of us. And that is why there are so many varieties of Christianity. To conclude, faith is certainly opposed to a certain type of reasoning, empirical reasoning, because faith really doesn't rely upon empirical evidence. As Wittgenstein points out, such proofs as exist for God existence aren't the foundation of a believer's faith. The foundation tends to be relational. I know God, I know Christ, I'm in relationship with Christ. We don't try, when we come to faith, to prove God by reason. If we do, we will arguably fail anyway. Look at David Hume and Immanuel Kant's arguments against the various proofs. Alistair McGrath also presents an interesting argument which it's worth researching if you want to hit A star. He argues that the way that natural theology developed in the Enlightenment to provide proofs for the existence of God was fundamentally misconceived. He returns to Augustine of the 4th century and argues that the role of natural theology and reason is to provide an integrating framework of faith, which he would argue, McGrath would argue, underpins all viewpoints, including Dawkins. And the question, therefore, is whether the Christian integrating framework makes more sense to you and me than Dawkins, not whether it is fundamentally opposed to science, to reason, or to anything else. The key quote for McGrath is one of C.S. Lewis's more famous statements, where Lewis says, "I believe in God as I believe the sun will rise tomorrow, not because I see it, but because by it I see everything else."